Today, we're going to be adding admin commands to our Roblox game. This command system is incredibly easy to set up and comes with some amazing features, like auto-completion when typing out a command, custom types to suggest different arguments as you write out your command, permissions for specifying who can or cannot use your commands, and much, much more. Now, in order to add commands into our game, we're going to be using a library called Cmdr, but it is spelled Cmdr. I'll leave a link down below in the description to the documentation on this library. For the most part, it is very easy to use and work with, while at the same time, it can be a little bit challenging, and depending on how far you want to go with this, it can become very complex. Now, while it can become very complex, keep in mind that whenever I use this in my own projects, most of the commands that I actually write are to help me debug different systems that I'm creating. One example of this would be, imagine you just created a shop system, and inside of that shop system, of course, you're selling different items for different amounts of coins. But what I want to do is I want to test being able to purchase an item, so I would want to create a command for giving myself some coins. And for a command like that, everything that we're doing is still very simple, and it really isn't getting into any complex realms. So for the most part, this library is as complex as you choose to make it. Anyways, with all that being said, we're going to want to go ahead and actually download this library. In order to download this library, I would recommend going down below in the description and finding the link which takes you to this GitHub page right here. Now, depending on when you're looking at this, the Cmdr version might be a little bit different. Currently, 1.12 is the latest version, but now when it comes to downloading it, it should pretty much be the same no matter what version it actually is. So, on the releases page, you're going to want to scroll down a little bit until you see contributors, and then you should see an asset section. Once you see asset, you should actually see a couple of different files that you can download. And the file that we want to download has an extension of RBXM, and it is called Cmdr. Now, I'm pointing out the extension of RBXM because we know that that is a file which can be imported directly inside of Roblox Studio. So that's how we can easily tell that it's the correct one. Anyway, go ahead and click on the file name, and that should prompt you to download that file onto your computer. Now that we've downloaded that file, we're going to want to go ahead and insert that into Roblox Studio. You should be able to just directly drag and drop that file from wherever you've saved it at into Roblox Studio, but in case that doesn't work for you, what you're going to want to do is right-click on any of the services inside of the Explorer and then select the Insert from File option. Once you click that, you're going to want to go to wherever you've saved the file at, select the file, and then go ahead and click on Open. That should then directly insert a module script called Cmdr inside of your workspace. And that means that we have officially imported the library into our Roblox Studio. But now we need to store this library somewhere, and the place that we want to store it at is actually inside of the server script service and inside of the folder called Packages. So let's go ahead and drag and drop the module script inside of that folder. Sweet, and now that we've done that, we've now put the Cmdr library exactly where we want it to be. So now that we've added the library to our project, let's begin setting this up on the server side. So we're going to go inside of the server script service, and we're going to go ahead and create a new folder. We'll go ahead and rename this folder to be called Cmdr. I keep wanting to say Cmdr, but I feel like if I say we're going to name the folder Cmdr, you're going to think we're literally going to type out the word Cmdr. But anyway, going further into the video, anytime I say the word Cmdr, keep in mind that usually if we're typing something, we're literally going to type out Cmdr, not the actual word Cmdr. But I feel like it makes a lot more sense to just say the literal word rather than spelling it out every single time I'm referring to it. Now, inside of this folder, we're going to want to go ahead and add in a brand new script. Of course, since this is a normal script, this will load when the game starts up, and we're going to use this script to basically set up everything that we need to set up for Cmdr. Anyways, let's go ahead and rename this script to be called Cmdr as well. And now that we've done that, inside of our script, we're going to want to go ahead and create a variable for the server script service. Now that we have the server script service, we're going to want to go ahead and require the Cmdr library that we stored inside of the packages folder. So we're going to go ahead and create a variable called Cmdr. Then we'll go ahead and require that module, which is inside of the server script service, inside of the packages folder, and it is called Cmdr. Now, the next thing that we're going to want to do is actually create 3 folders inside of our Cmdr folder. So I'm going to go ahead and create a brand new folder. This first folder, we're going to go ahead and rename to be called Commands. Then I'm going to go ahead and duplicate that folder by hitting Control D, or you can go ahead and right click and then click duplicate here as well. Now the second folder is going to be called Hooks. And then we're going to create one final folder, which is going to be called Types. Now the commands folder is probably the most self-explanatory one. Inside of the commands folder, we're going to actually store module scripts, which we're going to write, and then the Cmdr library will read from to understand how we have our commands set up. But then hooks and types, on the other hand, are a little bit harder to explain, and I think that they'll be easier to explain as we further write out the Cmdr startup script, and I explain all of that inside of here. So going back inside of our Cmdr script, what we're going to want to do is create a variable for each of these folders. So I'm going to go ahead and create a variable called commands, and now we'll go ahead and point that to the commands folder. So we'll go ahead and say script.parent.commands. Now, like I said, commands are the actual commands that can be ran in the game. Then I'm going to go ahead and create a variable called types, which is going to be for the types folder. So we'll say script.parent.types. Now, types are used to define custom types to use as arguments of our command. Cmdr comes with a few built-in types, but we want to add in our own depending on the specific command. One example of using types would be if we created a command called give currency. We would want to create a currency type, which would be a string that is either coins or gems. So we would want to be able to specify the specific currency that we would accept as an argument so that it can be auto-completed as we're typing out the command. And now for the final variable that we're going to create, that's going to be called hooks, and then we're going to go ahead and parent that to the hooks folder. Now, hooks are functions which are called when a command is used. There's two different events that we can hook onto for when an event is ran. The first event that we can hook onto is called before run, and that event is called before a command is ran. So one reason that we would hook into this event is because it's perfect for setting up a permission system. Before a command is ran, we want to verify that the player who is trying to run the command is actually allowed to run that command. And the second event that we can hook into is the after run event. And the after run event is of course called after a command is ran. And this event can be useful for hooking into because we can create a logging system to log which commands are being ran and different things like that. Now, Cmdr actually requires us to use at least a single before run hook before commands can be used in the game outside of Studio. This is to prevent people from adding commands to their game and then allowing anyone who knows how to use Cmdr to actually run them. Now, if that sounded confusing to you at all, don't worry, it's really simple, and as we go through this, you'll definitely have an easier time understanding that. With it being said, the next thing that we're going to do is actually register the default commands that Cmdr comes with. Now keep in mind, if you don't want to register the default commands, you definitely don't have to. Cmdr itself comes with a wide variety of commands that we can instantly use in our game if we want to. Some of those commands are kill for killing a player's character or humanoid, and we even have a kick command to kick any player from the game that we would want to. So to register the default commands, we're going to go ahead and say Cmdr to use the library, then we want to use a method of the library, and the method that we want to use is called register default commands. And that is a method or a function, so that's why we need to use the parentheses to treat it like it is. And you probably realized as we were typing that out, this library actually has zero auto-completion, at least when it comes to scripting. But when it comes to actually using the commands in game, that's where the real auto-completion comes in at, and it is very useful in that regard. But like I said in the beginning, this library is very easy to use and work with, but also at the same time, it can be a little bit complex, and this is one of the areas that I was talking about. So anytime we're scripting with Cmdr, we're pretty much left on our own because there is actually no auto-completion. So when you're writing any of these things out, you need to make sure that your spelling is identical and your capitalizations are all correct and everything else like that. Otherwise, it's going to be super easy for you to run into different issues. As you follow through this video, if you run into any errors, I would guarantee that the most likely reason for you running into an issue is because you made a spelling mistake or a capitalization difference or something small like that. So make sure if you have an error, you check if that is the reason why as the first case scenario. Anyways, now that we've registered all the default commands, the next thing that we want to do is register all of our custom commands. So to do that, we're again going to use the Cmdr library, but this time we're going to go ahead and use the register commands in method, and this method actually accepts a folder where all of our commands are stored at. So we're going to go ahead and pass through the commands variable, which is actually our commands folder. Then I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste that because the next thing that we want to register is actually the types. And now, instead of passing through the commands folder, we of course want to pass through the types folder. And then finally, we of course want to go ahead and register the hooks. So we'll go ahead and replace the word types with hooks, and then we'll go ahead and pass through the hooks folder. And now with that being said, we're now registering the default commands that Cmdr comes with, and then we're registering our custom commands, types, and hooks as well. Now, with that being said, we're actually fully finished with writing out this script, so we can go ahead and close out of that. Now, the next thing that I want to do is create a shared module script inside of the replicated storage, which we're going to use while working with Cmdr on both the server and the client side. So what I want to do is go inside of the replicated storage, and then we're going to create a brand new folder inside of here, which we'll go ahead and rename to be called configs. Then inside of this folder, I want to go ahead and add in a brand new module script, which we're going to go ahead and rename to be called Cmdr. Now, I'm going to delete everything inside of this module script and set it up how I normally would. So I'm going to go ahead and create my local variable, which is going to be equal to a table. I'll then go ahead and create my shared variable, which is going to be equal to a table. And of course, we're going to go ahead and return shared. And now inside of here, I'm going to go ahead and create a shared variable, which we're going to go ahead and call admins. And that's going to be equal to a table. Now inside of this table, I want to actually insert all of the user IDs of the admins of our game. Now, if you're like me, you may be the only person working on your game, so you may not have any other admins, but that's perfectly fine. We can just list ourselves in here. We don't have to list multiple people. But in order to do that, we still need to get our own user ID, and the easiest way to do that is by starting up our game. And then once our game has started up, let's look inside of the player service, select our own player, and then we can look for the user ID property of our player, click that box, copy that number, stop our game, go back inside of the Cmdr module that we just created, and then paste the number inside of here. And now we've basically just added ourselves to the admin list. And if you ever want to give other people access to your admin commands, then you're going to want to add their user IDs to this list right here. Now, with that being said, we're also done with this module script, so we can go ahead and close out of that. Now, the next thing that I want to do is set up Cmdr on the client. So in order to do that, we're going to go down to the starter player, inside of the starter player scripts, and then we're going to go ahead and create a local script inside of here. Of course, we'll go ahead and rename this local script to be called Cmdr. And now inside of this local script, we're going to want to go ahead and create variables for two different services. The first service that we're going to want to get is the player service. And the second service that we're going to want to get is actually the replicated storage. Then once we've created variables for both of those, we're going to want to go ahead and create a variable for the local player. So we'll go ahead and say players.localPlayer. Then we want to go ahead and create a variable for the Cmdr config that we just created. So we'll go ahead and say require replicated storage.configs.cmdr. And in addition to the config, we also want to create a variable for the Cmdr client, which the Cmdr client is a module that the Cmdr library actually creates when the game starts up for the very first time. Now actually, it's probably better that I just show you this visually in game. So I started my game up, and now if I look inside of the replicated storage, we now have a module script inside of the replicated storage called Cmdr client. And of course, before our game was started, that module script did not exist in there, and we certainly did not create that ourselves. Like I said, the library creates this when the game starts up for the very first time. So going back to our local script, that is the module script that we want to require. So we're going to go ahead and say require replicated storage, and then we want to use the wait for child method. And now what do we want to wait for? Well, we want to wait for a module called Cmdr client. And now that we've gotten the Cmdr client, we can actually set this up on the client side. And to set this up on the client side, we actually only need to do one single thing, and that is set the activation key for opening and displaying the terminal. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and use the Cmdr client library, and we'll use a method of it, which is called setActivationKeys. And like I said, it is a method, so we'll go ahead and include the parentheses. And now this function actually accepts an argument, which is a table. And now inside of this table, we can include all of the different keybinds that we would like players to be able to use in order to open up the terminal. And the keybind that I'm used to using is actually the F2 key. So we're going to go ahead and say enum.keycode, and then we'll specify the specific key code that we want to use, which I'm going to go ahead and use the F2 key. Now, this is a table, so you can include multiple different key codes if you want to. You could use both the F2 key and a semicolon, or anything else that you may want. But I'm only going to go ahead and set the activation to F2. Now, that is actually all that we have to do to set it up, but I'm going to do one more thing. And what I want to do is create a variable called isAdmin, because what I'd like to do is restrict any other player from opening up the command terminal besides only our admin players. And the only reason that I'm really doing that is for visual preferences. Like, if we allowed players to access the Cmdr terminal who don't have permissions to use any of the commands or are not admins, that would still be perfectly fine, because Cmdr will handle all of that and prevent them from running any commands. But one part of me is thinking, well, if a player is not able to use any of our commands, then what is the point of even allowing them to have access to the terminal, because it's not like they're able to use any of them at all. So we're going to go ahead and create a variable called isAdmin, and to determine if a player is an admin or not, what we're going to do is use the table.find function. And now the table that we want to look through is the Cmdr config.admins table. And what we want to look for is the player's user ID inside of that table. Because if the player's user ID exists inside of the admins table, then of course we know that that player is an admin. And now that we've created that variable, we're going to go ahead and say if isAdmin then. and then we'll go ahead and only set the activation inside of here if the player is an admin. But if the player is not an admin, then we're not going to set any activation keys because that player does not need to have access to the Cmdr terminal. And with that being said, we're fully finished with setting this up on the client side, so we can go ahead and close out of that, and we can even collapse the starter player as well because we're not going to be returning to that. Now, just to make sure you followed everything correctly and everything's been set up as it should be, let's go ahead and start up our game and see if we're actually able to access the Cmdr terminal. So once we load into the game, I'm going to go ahead and press my activation key, which is F2, and once I press that, we can actually see the Cmdr terminal has appeared right here. If you're pressing your activation key and you're not seeing the terminal pop up, then you probably messed up one of your scripts, and I would recommend that you go back through and verify that you've ran everything correctly. So now, returning back to the server script service, what we're going to want to do is set up a hook. Now, the hook that we're going to create is going to be for managing the permissions of each command, and this hook will effectively prevent people from using the commands that we do not want to actually use them. So inside of the hooks folder, we're going to go ahead and add in a brand new module script, which we're going to go ahead and rename to be called permissions. Then we can delete everything inside of this module script. And now the first thing that we want to do inside of this module script is create a variable for the replicated storage. So of course we'll say game get service, and then we want to get the replicated storage service. And the next thing that we want to do is go ahead and create a variable for the Cmdr config. So let's go ahead and require that from inside of the replicated storage, inside of the configs folder, and of course we'll get our Cmdr module script. Now that we've done that, what Cmdr wants us to do is actually return a function from this module script. Now this function is actually going to have a single parameter, which is going to be called registry. And of course registry is actually passed to us through the Cmdr library. Now since Cmdr doesn't have any types inside of Roblox Studio, in case you ever get confused, I think it might be helpful if I explain how you can visually see what you actually have access to from the registry. So inside of the Cmdr documentation, if we look at the API reference section, we can go down to the registry section and then click on that. Once we click on that, we can see types, properties, and methods. Now, for most of us, we probably don't really care about types, and we probably don't really care about Cmdr for the most part, but what we probably do care about is instance methods, which are essentially just functions that we're actually able to use. So the first method that we're able to use is register types in. And you might be thinking, wait, didn't we just use that in the first script that we created? And well, yes, that's true. We literally did use this exact method inside of the server script that we created at the very beginning. But now, if we scroll down a little bit, the function that we're actually going to want to use this time is called register hook. So we can see that register hook is a method of the registry, and it has 3 different parameters. The first parameter is the specific event that we want to hook onto, and we would specify that as a string. So our 2 options are before run and after run. Then we have callback, which is actually a function, and this basically allows us to write the logic for handling what happens when this hook is triggered. And if you're confused by this part at all, what this means is that this function actually returns something, and what it returns is a string. And since there's a question mark here, that means that it's optional. So it doesn't have to return a string, but if it does return something, then we should return a string. And the final parameter is priority, which also has a question mark here, so that means it's optional and we don't actually have to include this. But if we did include the priority, it would be a number. Then below that, we actually have the description of what this method is used for. So the description is adds a hook. This should probably be run on the server, but can also work on the client. Hooks run in order of priority, lower number runs first. And then it kind of explains the parameters once again right here, but the rest of the information we kind of already understand. Anyways, you might be wondering, why am I even showing you this? But like I said, inside of Roblox Studio, this library has no auto-completion. So without any auto-completion, you're literally required to look at how somebody else has set this up, or look at the documentation to see what you're actually able to specify inside of each function and different things like that. So going back to Studio, inside of this function, what we're going to want to do is use the registry, and we're going to want to use a method of the registry, which like I said, is the register hook method. Now, when we use the register hook method, what do we need to pass through to this method? Well, for the first argument, we need to pass through the specific event that we want to hook into. And the event that we want to hook into is the before run event. And then what was the second argument of this method? Well, that is the function. Now, this function has a single parameter, which is context, and then we'll go ahead and create our anonymous function. Now, going back to the documentation, we can go ahead and click on command context to see what the context actually is and what we actually get from context. And then we can see all of the different properties and the explanations of them. So if we said context.name, that would actually give us the specific name of the specific command that's about to be ran. It can also give us the group of the command that's going to be ran as well. And I haven't explained this yet, but basically we can group commands together using groups. And of course, by using groups, that allows us to easily specify what commands can be used by admins, helpers, or different groups that you create on your own. But now another very useful property that we have access to from the context is actually the executor. And the executor is actually the player who ran this command. So we can use the executor to determine who's trying to run the command. And if you keep scrolling through here, you can see a bunch of other properties and then even methods that you can use as well. But now, going back to Studio, we're going to go ahead and create a variable called user ID, because we wanted to determine the user ID of the player who's trying to run this command. And to get the user ID, we'll go ahead and use the context, and then we want to go ahead and access the executor property, which would give us the player who is running this command. And since we now have the player who is running this command, we then want to go ahead and get their user ID, so we'll just go ahead and say .userid. And now that we've gotten their user ID, let's go ahead and create a variable called isAdmin, and then we'll determine if they are an admin or not. And we've already done this once on the client side, so to determine if they are an admin or not, we'll go ahead and use the table.find function. Of course, the table that we want to look through is the Cmdr Config.admins table, and the thing that we want to look for inside of that table is this player's user ID. So we've now determined if the player is an admin or not. The next thing that we want to do is create a variable called isAdminCommand, and now what we're going to do is check if the group of this command is admin. So we'll go ahead and say context.group. And now that we've gotten the group, we want to check if that group is admin. Now, like I said, we didn't really go over groups that much, but when we create a command, we can specify the group that that command belongs to. So that allows us to basically easily create commands and then limit who's able to use those commands based on different groups. For instance, you most likely want to have certain commands locked to admins, and then you might even want to have certain commands locked to helpers or moderators or different roles in your game and things like that. So using groups easily allows us to do all of that. So now that we've created all of those variables, the next thing we're going to do is create an if statement. And what we're going to say is if this is an admin command and the player is not an admin, so we'll say not admin, then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and return a string. So what we're effectively doing here is creating an if statement for if the player who is trying to use this command does not actually have access or is not allowed to actually use that command. So with this string, I'm going to say you do not have permission to use this command. But of course, you can use whatever message you'd like to. Now that we've created that if statement, we are pretty much fully finished with creating this hook, but there's one more thing that we want to do. And now what we're going to do is effectively set up the logic for preventing players from using Cmdr's default commands. And to do that, we're effectively going to lock all of those commands to only admin players. So we're going to say if not is admin, then. And if the player is not an admin, then we're going to go ahead and simply just return the exact same message. Now, this might seem really confusing, but if we remove this if statement and we only have this if statement, what this does is it only is going to check if the command is an admin command, and then if it is an admin command, it'll then check if the player is an admin or not. And if the player is not admin, then we'll go ahead and return this message. But by not returning anything, that means that the player does actually have permission to run the command. So that's why we're returning something when the player does not have permission to run the command. But then we're creating this if statement here to prevent players from using the default commands or any commands which we have not specified to be a part of the admin group. So this if statement doesn't even actually apply to only Cmdr's default commands. This if statement even protects you for your own custom commands. So if we create a custom command and we don't add that command to the admin group, then without this if statement, any player would be allowed to actually use that command because it is not an admin command, so this hook is not even checking for that. So again, that's why we're actually adding the second if statement here to prevent any commands from running unless the player is an admin. But of course, as you further use the system, like I said, you might want to make your own groups and do different things like that. After you see how we've created our admin group, you should be able to easily create your own groups like helpers, moderators, or different things like that, and have your entire command system set up however you specifically want it to be. Now, actually, I think to make this even easier to understand, what I'm going to do is actually test this out and visually display it to you. Now, of course, if we were to start up the game right now, we would be able to use the commands because we've already specified our user ID as an admin. But if I go to the test tab and then I click start, once I eventually load into the game, I'm loading into the game as a player called player 1 and not actually Monster. So now if I try to use the kill command, for example, I get the message, you do not have permission to use this command. But now let me go back to our permission tab and let's actually remove this if statement right here. So now our hook is only working for commands which are a part of the admin group. So now once I load into the game and I use the kill command, I am actually able to use the kill command even though I'm not specified as an admin. So hopefully that visual demonstration helps you understand why we need to include this if statement here, because without it, players would have access to all of the commands which belong to groups aside from just the admin group itself. Anyways, with all that being said, we're fully finished with setting up this permissions hook, so we can go ahead and close out of this module script. And now the next thing I want to do is go ahead and create our first command. So inside of the commands folder, I'm going to to go ahead and create a brand new module script. And now I want to create a command for adjusting the player's currency. So I'm going to call this command adjust currency. And now before we start modifying this module script, in order to create a command, every single command has to actually have 2 module scripts created for it. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this module script. And now for the second module script, we want to rename this to be called adjust currency and then the keyword server. So make sure that you name the module script exactly the same way, but you want to add the word server to the end of the name of the module script. Now inside of the adjust currency module, we can actually delete everything inside of here, and then we're going to use a return statement, and all we're going to return inside of this module is actually a table. And with this table, we're basically going to define the command. So we're going to specify the name, the group, the arguments, and different things like that. But with the adjust currency server is where we'll actually write the logic and a function for handling what happens when the command is ran. Anyways, starting off with defining the command, what we're first going to do is specify the name property. Of course, the name property has to be a string, and the naming scheme that Cmdr uses is first they start off with a lowercase letter. So I'm going to go ahead and say adjust currency just like that. Then I'll add a comma and we'll specify the next property, which is called aliases. And this is actually a table of strings. And keep in mind, this is actually optional, so you don't have to include this property if you don't want to, but inside of this table, you can include different strings that you can also use for this command. Now, generally, anytime I create aliases, I just sort of create abbreviations for the command, so I would add an alias for this, which would be AC. So instead of typing out adjust currency, we could literally just type out AC and run the command that way. And now we can specify our next property, which is called description, and that is equal to a string, and this string will be displayed in the terminal whenever we actually select this command. So I'll describe this command as adjusts the currency of a player by the specified amount. Then after that, we have the group property, which is also a string, and the string can be whatever we want it to be. So like I said, if you want to create multiple different groups in your game, you could create a group called helper, you can create a group called mods, you can create a group called admin. You can create whatever groups you actually want to, and then use that to group your functions together and limit who's able to use what commands. So for this command, I'm going to add it to the admin group. And remember when we just created the permission hook? We literally just set that up to work with the admin group as we just added this command to. Then I'll add another comma, and then we'll go ahead and specify the next property, which is actually called args. And the word args is short for arguments. Now, args is actually a table, and this table is actually going to be an array of more tables. And inside of each of those tables, we'll add some properties to define each specific argument. So inside of this table, let's go ahead and create another table. And now inside of this table, we're going to go ahead and define some properties. The first property that we're going to define is going to be called type, which is going to be a string. Now, Cmdr comes with a couple of pre-built types. Of course, they have the basic types like string, number, boolean, and different things like that. And they even have a little bit more of complex types like player. And now whenever we specify the type of an argument, we need to do that in all lowercase letters. So now the first argument that I'm going to specify is actually the currency of which we want to modify. And that would actually be a string. Now keep in mind that we will actually come back to this. After we create this command, we'll actually create our own custom type to define the specific strings. And then we'll come back and update this type. But for right now, we're just going to set this as a string. Then the second property of an argument is the name property. And the name is just what is visually displayed to the player in the command terminal. So the name that I want to go with for this is currency, because I would want the player to specify the specific currency that they want to modify. And now after that, we have a third property, which is called description. And I'm going to set this to the currency you want to adjust. And there we go. We've specified our first argument. Now I'll go ahead and add a comma and create another table. Now that we've specified the currency that we want to modify, we'll then add another argument where we can specify the amount that we want to adjust that currency by. So for type this time, I'm going to say number. Then for the name, I'm going to say amount. And then for the description, I'm going to say the amount you want to adjust the currency by. And then we're going to add one final argument to this command, and the type of this argument is actually going to be a player. Then we'll set the name of this to be player. Then we'll set the description of this to be the player whose currency you want to adjust. Now we're actually going to add one more property to this argument, which is going to be called optional. And we're going to set the value of that to true in order to make this argument optional so that the player does not need to specify a specific player. And the reason that we're doing that is because what if we just wanted to adjust our own currency real quick? If that's what we want to do, then there's no need to specify ourselves as who we actually want to modify the currency of. Instead, we just don't include a player, and then we'll know that by default, we want to adjust our own currency. Now, when it comes to writing the logic for that command, we'll actually set that logic up there. It's not like Cmdr does this by default or anything, but that's the reason why we're making this optional. So anytime you make an argument optional, that means that the argument does not need to be included in the command every single time in order for it to actually run. Okay, and with all that being said, we've now fully finished with defining our adjust currency command. And now the next thing that we can do is go ahead and open up the adjust currency server module script. And like I said, inside of here is where we'll actually write all of the logic which is performed when the command is actually ran. Now, I'm going to delete everything inside of this module script, and then the first thing that I want to do is create a variable for the server script service. And the reason for that is because I then want to create a variable for the player data service. So we'll go ahead and require that from inside of the server script service, inside of the services folder, and then we have our player data service. And now inside of this module, what Cmdr wants us to do is actually return a function. Now, this function is going to have a few parameters. The first parameter that every single command actually has is called context. So by default, that is given to us from the Cmdr library. And if we want to learn more about what's included in the context, then we should of course look at the API documentation. But then every parameter after this is actually from all the arguments that we've specified when we defined our command. So if we take a look back and when we defined the command, what are the arguments that we specified? Well, we have the currency, which is a string. Then we have amount, which is a number, and then we have the player argument, which is optional, and that would be a player. So coming back to here, creating this function, what we're going to say is currency. Then we'll specify that as a string. Then we have the amount argument, which we'll specify as a number. And then we have player, which is of the player type, and that is optional. So we'll go ahead and include a question mark there. And now that we've done all that, we can hit enter, and now we've actually created this function. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that the names that you specify for the parameters here, they don't actually have to match the exact same names that you specified inside of here. That does not matter at all. These names are completely unrelated to whatever names that you put inside of here. Instead of saying amount, we could say something like coins or something, for example. Like the name of the parameter doesn't actually matter at all for how we define the command. Anyways, when it comes to writing the actual logic of this, remember how I said if we don't include a player, what I want to do is specify the player as whoever ran this command. So the first thing that we're going to do is say player equals, and now if a player was passed through to this function, then we're going to go ahead and use the player argument. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and get the player from the context. And in order to get the player from the context, we can use the executor property of the context because executor is the player who actually ran this command. Now that we've gotten the player of whoever's currency that we want to modify, the next thing that we want to do is go ahead and create an action for modifying their currency using the player data service. So we'll specify the type of this to be player data service.state action, which of course is a table. And now the action that we're going to use is actually the update currency action. The currency that we're going to use is the currency that's been passed through to this function. And now the amount that we want to update the currency by is actually the amount which was passed to this function as well. Now that we've created that action, let's go ahead and actually update the player's data by using the player data service. So we'll say player data service.update state. Then we'll go ahead and pass through the player, and then we'll also pass through their action as well. And now just right there alone is actually all that we need to do for writing the logic for this function. But I'm going to make this a little bit better because anytime we run a command, we can actually return a string, and that string will be displayed in the terminal after we've ran the command. Now, that can be useful for a lot of things. One thing, for example, which doesn't actually work here, but imagine if the update state command actually returned true or false. So what I would do is create a variable here called did update. And then what I would say is if did update, then we would go ahead and return a string which says did update currency. But then we'll say else, and if we did not successfully update their state, then we would go ahead and return did not update currency. So this is one example where I really like to use the return statement because otherwise, for the most part, returning a message here I feel like is pretty useless other than scenarios like this. But in order for me to just to be able to show you this, what I'm going to do is create a variable called state, and then we're going to go ahead and get the player state. So we're going to go ahead and say player data service.get state, and then we're going to go ahead and get the player state. Now, if we're not actually able to get their state, then what we're going to do is return a message that says player state not found. But then after this, let's go ahead and create a variable called balance, and then we'll go ahead and get the player's balance of their currency. So we'll go ahead and index the state with the currency, and then we'll go ahead and return. And now what are we going to return? Well, we'll say player.name now has, and then we'll include the balance, and then we'll also include the currency as well. So this will say something like player now has 5,000 coins, for example. And with that being said, we finished writing all the logic for this command. So let's go into our game and actually test this out. Now, once we get into our game, let's open up the command terminal, and then we'll go ahead and start typing out the command name. And as we're typing it out, we can see that this command is automatically suggested to us. Now, alternatively, we could type out the abbreviation or the alias that we included there as well, which is AC. And when we type out AC, we can see that this command is still given to us. Now, you can hit tab and that will autocomplete the command for you. But you could also just type out AC, then hit space, and then when you hit space, it then displays to us the first argument. And the first argument is currency, which is a string, and then we can clearly see the description there as well. Now, the currency that I want to update is actually the gems currency. Then I hit space again, and I can see the third argument. So the amount that I want to adjust this by is, let's just say, 1,000. Then I hit space again, and we see the player argument. And we even see the players that I have suggested to us. So I could begin typing out my name, for example, and then I can go ahead and hit the tab key. And we can see that my name is fully typed out for us. So now that we've typed this command out completely, we can go ahead and hit enter. And once we hit enter, we can see that my gems have actually been adjusted. And if we look at the terminal, we can see Monster now has 2,050 gems. So that's the return statement working exactly as it should right there. Now also just to show you, the player argument is optional. So let's just not even include that and just hit enter. And then once we hit enter, we can see the same thing is happening. And now this time it displays that I have 3,050 gems. If you're wondering why this pops up, I'm just double clicking inside the terminal and this keeps popping up, which I'm not sure why it pops up, but it does. Anyway, yeah, that's pretty much how this terminal works. So if you're at least seeing these messages up here, you do know that it is all working exactly as it should. So now that we've verified that that command is working as intended, the next thing that we're going to do is create our own custom type. So inside of the types folder, we're going to go ahead and create a brand new module script, which we're going to rename to be called currency, because we want to create a type which specifies the two different currencies that the player can use in this command. So let's go ahead and delete everything inside of this module script, and then I'm going to go ahead and create a variable. Now, this is going to be a constant, which I'm going to call currencies, and that's going to be equal to a table. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what a constant is a variable which does not change. Generally, when you write a constant, you write the name out in all capital letters. Inside of this table, we're going to include strings for each of the different currencies in our game. So I'll add the first currency, which is called coins. Then I'll add a comma, and the second currency is called gems. And now that we've created a table with our currencies, the next thing that we want to do inside of this module script is actually return a function. So we'll go ahead and say return function, and this function is going to have a single parameter, which is again going to be the registry. And now, sort of similar to how we registered hooks, we're going to use a method of the registry, which is called register type. Now, for the first argument of this method, we need to specify the name of the type. And to follow Commander's naming scheme, I would recommend writing the name of your types starting with a lowercase letter. So I would say currency. And now this is where it kind of gets a little bit confusing. And I don't really have any easy way to explain this or make it easier to understand for you, in my opinion. Basically, we're going to go ahead and use the registry, which gives us access to Commander. Then Commander gives us access to something called util, and util gives us access to a function called makeEnumType. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what an enum is, in this context, think of an enum as coins or gems. Both of these would be a separate enum. So gems would be an enum and coins would be an enum. Now, when we use this function, the first argument that we need to specify is basically the name of our type. So we're just going to go ahead and repeat currency. And the second argument that we need to pass through to this function is actually the table that we want to create enums from. So we'll go ahead and pass through currencies. Now, I could further explain what an enum is and kind of further explain this, but I really don't think there's any value in me explaining this to you because one, it's kind of complex and I just don't think it's really easy to wrap your head around. But basically, to give you a quick summary of what we're doing here, pretty much we're converting a table of strings, which we're basically wanting to use as auto-completion suggestions whenever we're writing out a command, and effectively we're using this function in order to do that from simply passing through a single table. Anyways, with that being said, we've now actually fully finished creating this custom type. Let's go ahead and actually use it. So I'm going to go ahead and exit out of this module script, and then we're going to go back to our adjust currency module script. Remember, this is the module script where we sort of just define the command itself. Now inside of this module script, we can actually see our first argument is the currency argument, and we set the type as a string. But now that we've created our own custom type, we can go ahead and set the type of this as currency. Now remember, make sure that you spell it exactly the same way as you created your own custom type. Make sure the capitalization is the exact same and everything else like that. And now that we've specified the type here, let's go into our game and test this out. So once we get into our game, let's open up the terminal, start using the adjust currency command, and when we start to use this command, we can now see that the currencies are now suggested to us. And we can use our arrow keys to toggle between whichever one we actually want to use. And let's just say that we want to use gems, for example. We can go ahead and highlight gems, then hit tab, and now we can see that gems has been automatically filled in for us. So then I can go ahead and say like 999, and then hit enter, and now we can see that that command has been ran. So that is why you would want to create your own custom type in order to use autofill to make our lives a little bit easier. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, with all that being said, I hope that you did enjoy the video. I know it might have been a longer one, but I wanted to do my best at thoroughly explaining how to use this library and really breaking down everything I could to make it as simple and as easy to understand as possible. Now, keep in mind that I'm not a gigantic fan of Cmdr. There definitely are some issues with this that can be very hard to diagnose and actually fix. Mainly the error that I'm referring to is sometimes I don't know what actually causes it. I've literally spent hours trying to figure this out, but while I was creating my simulator series, I ran into an issue where the custom commands that I added to the game actually just did not appear inside of the terminal. And that was random. Like, let's say 9 out of 10 times that I started the game, the commands would not appear. That doesn't mean that the default commands didn't appear, because they still did actually appear, but the commands that I created, they did not appear for some reason. So while that issue is pretty bad and pretty annoying, like that literally prevents me from using my own commands, as long as you don't fully rely on Cmdr, which I'm never going to throughout this entire series. I'm really only going to be using Cmdr for different things like easily debugging different systems in our game as we script them. It's really not that big of a deal. Plus, there's a lot of advantages to using Cmdr. It's very battle tested, meaning it's been used by many large games over multiple years. I mean, even games like Pet Simulator X or Adopt Me, they literally use this library as well. So it's very commonly used throughout the community. So you know that you can trust and rely on this library. But that doesn't mean that it's perfect, and that doesn't mean that better solutions are not able to come along. It's just that even in the matter of years since it's been created, there has really not been any good alternative that has come along yet, which is pretty unfortunate, but that's just the case that we're in. I mean, to be completely fair to Cmdr, realistically, it pretty much has all the features that you ever could literally need in a command library. Maybe you have your own niche use cases where you might have to do certain things for yourself, but for 99% of people, this library will be perfectly fine for them. Like I said though, the only really downfall that I've had and experience with this is if you run into the issue of commands not loading for whatever reason could possibly cause it. And then I guess also another downside to it is that there is no typings for when you're actually scripting with this. And because of that, it literally requires you to pretty much have the API open on a second monitor so that you can read from the website what you actually have access to when you're using the variables like registry or Cmdr or different things like that. This library definitely forces you to heavily rely on the documentation. But what I would recommend that you do is use that GitHub repository that I linked you to that we've downloaded this from. And inside of there, you can explore the default commands. Or you can even search on GitHub and find how other people have used Cmdr and see how they've set up their commands and have done different things like that as well. So yeah, overall, currently this is definitely the best command library, but unfortunately it does require you to do a little bit more learning than, say, other libraries might. Either way though, at least we have added commands into our game, and now that we've created our first commands and we've kind of gone through setting up all the different things that we've set up, when we want to create our second command, it's going to be very easy compared to everything that we kind of just did in this episode right now. So with all that being said, I hope that you guys did enjoy the video. As always, if you did enjoy the video, make sure you smash the like button. Please leave a comment down below if this did work for you and if you made it this far. It lets others who are watching this video months or years in the future know that this video is still actually working, and if they're having an issue, they may have made a mistake on their end. Also, if you'd like to gain access to a ton of resources and support me, you can visit the link down below in the description to my website, MonzterDev, or my Patreon, where, like I said, you can get access to a ton of resources to use to easily create your own Roblox game. Anyways, with all that being said, I hope that you guys have a great day, and I'll see you guys in the next video. But anyways, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to be it for this episode. As always, if you did enjoy, make sure you smash the like button. Please leave a comment down below letting other people know that it did work. I and they really do appreciate it. It helps everyone out. And as usual, if you want to gain access to all the scripts and the game file that we made during this episode, as well as a ton of other assets, you can visit MonzterDev or my Patreon, link down below in the description to both of these. You can gain access to a ton of assets to easily create your next Roblox game, as well as support me in creating all the content that I create. Anyways, with all that being said, I hope that you guys have a great day, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.